Hi, welcome to part 2 of casting a bangle. In the first video you saw me cast in a vertical flask, and in part 2 we're going to do a horizontal flask. And we're going to be casting in place faceted sapphires and diamonds. Let's get to it.
Okay, so I've got my big horizontal flask. I've got my object. Start with the male side first, which is the one with the exposed lip. Lip face down, pack it from behind. Let's tack and powder up that surface. Let's place this bangle in. Push it into about halfway. I like to use the ruler to help me disperse that pressure. Put the lid on top, lining up those registration marks. And now add some loose crumbly clay and press it down with your fingers to make sure it's all tightly packed around that object. Let's pull the two apart nice and evenly. Cool. Okay. So as you can be able to see, this bangle is quite thin, and I want to make that a bit thicker. So just like we did in part 1 with the other bangle, we're going to do the same with this one. We're going to push it into this clay deeper into both sides so that our silver version will be a thicker, wider version of this bangle. I'm going to use this paintbrush to help me push the object in deeper. This is why it's quite important to make sure your clay is flush on the back, because that means that this clay is all fully supported when I'm pressing this object in. If it wasn't supported, if that back was concave, then the clay would have so much room to give way that my two clay halves wouldn't actually be fitting snugly together anymore. One side would be bowed like this, and you would have a massive amount of spillage. Huge mess to clean up. I want to make sure this has an inside diameter of 61 millimeters. So I'm lucky enough to have access to a 3D printer. So I was able to get the exact size I needed 3D printed. If you don't have access to a 3D printer, then using bangle sizes is a great way of getting around it. You can get them from pretty much any jewelry supplier. So I'm using this like a cookie cutter. To make sure it's exactly the same spot on this opposite side, I'm just going to close this up and open it again, lining up those registration marks. Cool. Let's pull this out. Let's clean up all that extra, all this. Just making these two halves, these two sections blend together. We're going to have to repattern the silver version. See how this version's got all these scowl marks in it? We're going to have to do the same thing, but in the silver version now. Just so that it doesn't look like two things have been placed together to make one. Got my embossing tool just to run over that rough surface and smooth it down a little bit. all done to that side. Got to do the same to this side now. Let's do our sprue hole and funnel. Now this is where it's going to get a little bit different to anything I've shown before. We're going to be doing multiple sprues. So more than one sprue, but only one funnel. I know, tricky. So I'll show you how to do that. The reason why we have to have multiple sprues is because if all the metal was pouring in just one section here, it's not going to reach the full negative space. Like, it's not going to cast properly. It's going to cool down before it can get to the opposite end. So we have to have metal being poured in multiple points at the same time. So let me show you how to do that. I've got a metal straw and I'm going to cut a hole out on a very strong angle, as much of an angle as I can. All the way through. I'm going to do another hole on the opposite side. And I'm going to try and get this hole to meet this hole in the middle somewhere, hopefully. Again, coming in on a very strong angle. Alright, not too bad. Push that clay down a little bit. I did disturb it a wee bit. So let's just push that down. Okay. Now, let's carve this out a little bit. Now we've got to fuss a bit with these two holes to try and get it so that when you pour the metal in this one funnel, it's going to go down both of these holes. It's going to split and go down both sides. So we're going to have a little bit of fussing, just trying to get this right. And as always, making sure our holes are nice and clean, no loose bits of clay. I've got to try and get where these two meet quite even so that the metal doesn't favour going all down one side rather than the other. I want it to split nice and evenly so that we get even amounts of molten metal filling this flask on both sides. Let's place some stones. I'm going to be putting them on both sides. But I want to try and avoid the metal being poured directly on top of the stone, here and here. That's where the metal is going to be poured directly into the flask. So I want to avoid placing stones there and there, but I'll put them around. Okay, I've got my embossing tools. let's do some little beads to hold these stones in place. So I'm going to start with the main stone. Great. So you can see how that stone is halfway over those holes we've just created, which means that when we cast it, the silver will be half over the stone, securing it in place. So I haven't pushed any of these stones down yet. Yeah, cool, not about there, so. So I've got more pawpaw on them this time, and I've pushed them in a little bit deeper this time. Hopefully we won't have any stones sliding out of position. I've used the embossing tools to make these little feature marks, so it's a little bit more interesting. So we've got our 2 sprue holes. Let's do our air vents. I've gone and grabbed one of my rat's tail files, because that'll be long enough to make it all the way through. So I've got an air vent, because the tool I normally use is just a bit too short for this big flask. So I've got 2 air vents right where we want the metal to meet. Let's close this up and cast. Lining up those registration marks. I'm going to give the clay a little bit of a push to make sure those 2 clay halves are snug and tight against each other. So hopefully we don't have any spillage. I've got safety glasses on and I've got a mask on. Because this is the client's scrap metal, it's probably going to be very dirty and it'll probably smoke a lot. I've got some borax on hand in case I need to clean up this metal, which I might. So the top of this is a bit yucky. I'm just going to sprinkle some borax on it to clean it up. That should clean up that surface. That's looking better. Alright, let's cast. Gotta try and get it down both those holes. So I want to try and pour right in the middle of those 2 holes. You gotta do it really quick. You gotta throw it down that hole. Ooh, bit of spillage. Well, let's open this up and see what's inside. Anticipation. cool. It's a little bit warm. Smoking away. Oh no. Didn't quite make it, did it? And that stone isn't in place. But I'm not too worried because I know I can fill this area up with metal and build up grains for those claws. Or I could pull these stones out and start again. The reason why I think it didn't quite make it here is because my holes weren't in the middle. I think if they were more evenly distributed in the middle, I would have had more of a chance of the metal forming properly. Or I could have done 3 holes or 4 holes. I'm not too bothered because I know how I can fix this. I'll get it out of the clay, I'll clean it up a bit, and then I'll show you guys. And here is that bangle cleaned up a bit. So this is the section that I built up. I actually fused the silver in this section, and then I seated all these stones and then soldered little beads on them so that they matched all the cast in place ones that I'd done. And this is where I've cleaned up where the sprues were. So you can see there's a slight difference in the texture. But hopefully once I clean that up a little bit more, I'll disguise it. So I've still got a little way to go. But it's close. It's close. Pretty happy with it.
So I was looking back through the videos of making this one in the horizontal flask, and I figured out what went wrong. It wasn't that there wasn't enough sprue holes. Like, I could totally have cast it with just the 2. What the problem was, so one of the sprue holes was right here in the center of the bangle design, and the other one was sort of on the edge. It wasn't in the middle. So only half of the metal being poured through that hole was getting into this negative space of the bangle, where with this side, it being right in the middle, 100% of that metal that poured in there went into the negative space. So that's where I went wrong with this one. So lucky we've got video so I could go back and check. Thought I'd just mention that. It's a bit more helpful to know exactly what went wrong. But if you're worried that there's not going to be enough metal going through, you can always use 3 sprues or 4 if you want to. Obviously, the less sprues you use, the less cleanup for you. So we did a vertical flask with cast in place faceted sapphires and a horizontal flask with multiple sprue. And with this one, I would make sure all my stones are stuck down a little bit more, because that one little diamond did sneak out. Thanks for watching part 1 and part 2 of sand casting bangles. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content. I mean, I'd love it if I got so many followers that YouTube started paying me to make you videos, because that's win-win, hey? All right, well, until next time.
That's my home.